No, no way. What did you just do?
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I thought it was a copy.
A copy? That's my grandfather's Purple Heart.
Government worker shredded veteran's Purple Heart certificate. Secretary of Defense called within 5 minutes. When Robert Chen brought his grandfather's Purple Heart certificate to the VA office for a simple address update, clerk Amanda Phillips was having the worst day of her career. Her desperate attempt to fix a filing violation would trigger a phone call that changed everything. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily in the cramped waiting room of the Phoenix VA Regional Office, casting harsh shadows across rows of plastic chairs filled with veterans of all ages. The smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with the anxiety that seemed to permeate every government building. A handwritten sign taped to the reception window read, "Records audit in progress. Expect delays." And the tension among staff was palpable. Robert Chen stood quietly in line, a manila folder clutched in his weathered hands. At 65, he was a retired electrical engineer with salt and pepper hair and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades dealing with bureaucracy. But today felt different. Today, he carried something that had taken him months to work up the courage to bring here. His grandfather, Master Sergeant William Chen, had been one of the Chinese-American soldiers who served with distinction in World War II's Pacific Theater. Despite facing discrimination both at home and in the military, William had earned a Purple Heart after being wounded during the Battle of Okinawa. Robert's earliest memory was sitting on his grandfather's lap, carefully touching the edges of that certificate while William spoke in halting English about honor and duty. Robert had inherited not just the certificate, but the weight of being the only family member who truly understood its significance. His own children lived busy lives in other cities. His cousins had lost touch with their military heritage, and Robert sometimes felt like the last guardian of a story that was slowly being forgotten. The Purple Heart certificate wasn't just paper. It was the physical proof that his family belonged in America, earned through blood and sacrifice. The task seemed simple: update his grandfather's address in the VA system from the old family home to Robert's current residence. But Robert had learned to be careful with government offices. He'd seen too many veterans' families struggle with lost paperwork, misfiled claims, and bureaucratic indifference. That's why he'd brought the original Purple Heart certificate, not because it was required, but because he'd learned that showing respect for military documents usually earned respect in return. The opportunity had come from an unexpected conversation with his 16-year-old granddaughter, Emma. She'd been assigned a family history project and had asked Robert about her great-great-grandfather's military service. As Robert tried to explain William's story, he realized how little documentation he actually had. Just the Purple Heart certificate and a few faded photographs. "Grandpa," Emma had said, "don't you think we should make sure the government knows about his service? What if something happens to you and nobody remembers him?" Her words had hit Robert like a physical blow. He was 65, recently diagnosed with early-stage diabetes, and suddenly very aware of his own mortality. What would happen to William's legacy if Robert didn't act? That night, Robert had taken the Purple Heart certificate from its frame for the first time in years. The paper was more fragile than he remembered, yellowed at the edges, and the official seal showed signs of age. Looking at his grandfather's name written in careful script, Robert made a promise. He would ensure William Chen was properly remembered in official records, no matter how much bureaucracy he had to navigate. Robert's engineering background served him well in planning the VA visit. He spent weeks researching procedures, downloading forms, and even calling the office twice to confirm what documentation he'd need. The young woman who answered the phone both times had been helpful but stressed, mentioning something about a major records review that had everyone working overtime. He assembled a comprehensive folder, his grandfather's original enlistment papers, the Purple Heart citation, medical records from his war wounds, death certificate, will documentation, and his own identification. Robert even wrote a brief family history explaining why updating the records mattered, not just for bureaucratic completeness, but for preserving the memory of a soldier who had given everything for his country. The night before his appointment, Robert carefully wrapped the Purple Heart certificate in acid-free tissue paper. His wife, Linda, had suggested leaving it home and just bringing copies. But Robert felt strongly that the original document carried more weight. "They need to see what they're really dealing with," he'd explained. "This isn't just paperwork, it's history." Robert arrived at the VA office 30 minutes early, but the waiting room was already crowded with veterans and family members holding similar folders and wearing similarly patient expressions. The receptionist, clearly overwhelmed, was fielding constant phone calls while trying to check people in for appointments that were running increasingly behind schedule. When his number was finally called after a 2-hour wait, Robert approached window 7 with measured optimism. The nameplate read, "Amanda Phillips, Veteran Services Clerk," and she looked like she was barely holding herself together. Her blonde hair had escaped its bun, there were coffee stains on her blouse, and her eyes had the glazed look of someone who had processed too many cases without enough sleep. "I need to update my grandfather's address in your system," Robert began gently, sliding his folder through the window. "He was a Purple Heart recipient from World War II, and I'd like to make sure his records are current." Amanda glanced at the clock, 4:47 p.m., and Robert could see her calculating how many more cases she'd need to handle before closing time. Despite her obvious stress, Amanda began processing Robert's request with professional competence. She typed his grandfather's information into the computer, nodding approvingly at the thoroughness of his documentation. "Master Sergeant William Chen," she read from her screen. "Purple Heart, Pacific Theater. Your paperwork looks complete, Mr. Chen." For the first time in hours, Robert felt hopeful. Amanda seemed to understand the importance of what they were dealing with, and she handled his grandfather's documents with appropriate care. She made copies of the key papers, asked relevant questions about his family's contact information, and even commented on William's service record. "The Pacific Theater was brutal," she said quietly. "Your grandfather was a hero." The process moved smoothly until Amanda encountered what appeared to be a system error. Her computer screen flickered, then displayed a message that made her frown. "Record flagged for audit review. Requires supervisory approval." She tried refreshing the screen several times, but the message persisted. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen. The system is giving me problems. Let me get my supervisor." Amanda's supervisor, Gary Martinez, was already handling 3 other complicated cases, but he recognized the gravity of Robert's situation immediately. A 20-year VA employee and Army veteran himself, Gary treated the Purple Heart certificate with the reverence it deserved. "Mr. Chen, this is a beautiful document. Your grandfather served with distinction." Gary's involvement attracted attention from other veterans in the waiting area. An elderly Korean War veteran overheard their discussion and approached the counter. "Did someone say $400 second support unit?" he asked Robert. "My unit worked with those boys in Korea. Finest soldiers I ever served alongside." Soon, a small group had gathered, sharing stories about Asian American military service and the discrimination their families had faced. The conversation revealed details about William's service that Robert had never known. The Korean War veteran mentioned that Chinese American soldiers like William had often been given the most dangerous assignments because commanders assumed they were expendable. "Your grandfather didn't just earn that Purple Heart," the old soldier said firmly. "He earned respect from every man who served with him." Gary's computer access allowed him to dig deeper into William's service record, and what he found was remarkable. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice filled with excitement, "your grandfather's unit was involved in some of the most significant intelligence operations of the Pacific War. These records were classified for decades. That's why the system is flagging them for review." This discovery transformed Robert's simple address update into something much more significant. Gary began the process of not only updating the contact information, but ensuring that William Chen received full recognition for previously classified service. "We need to make sure your grandfather gets every honor he deserves," Gary promised, pulling out additional forms for posthumous recognition. But their progress was interrupted by Amanda's growing panic about the time. She'd been checking the clock obsessively, and Robert could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. "Mr. Martinez," she called out, "I still have 7 more cases to process, and the audit team is coming first thing tomorrow morning to review all our pending files." The audit team Amanda mentioned was the source of the chaos that had gripped the Phoenix VA office for weeks. Federal investigators were reviewing filing procedures after a whistleblower complaint about missing veterans' records. Every employee was under intense scrutiny, and any paperwork irregularities could result in disciplinary action or job loss. Amanda had already received 2 written warnings about her case processing speed and file organization. Her supervisor had made it clear that another violation could end her career, and she was a single mother who couldn't afford to lose her federal benefits. The pressure had been building for weeks, affecting her sleep, her health, and her judgment. As Gary worked on William's recognition paperwork, Amanda noticed something that made her stomach drop. The original Purple Heart certificate wasn't in the official file jacket she'd prepared. It was still sitting loose on her desk, mixed in with other documents. According to the new audit guidelines, any original military documents had to be properly filed or returned to families immediately. Keeping originals overnight was a major violation. The clock now read 4:58 p.m. The office closed at 5 gloss. Gary was still working on the complex recognition paperwork, and Amanda faced an impossible choice: violate the new filing protocols and risk her job, or find a way to resolve the document issue immediately. Amanda's mind raced through her limited options. She couldn't return the certificate to Robert while Gary was still processing the recognition paperwork. He needed the original for verification. She couldn't file it properly because the case wasn't complete. And she absolutely couldn't leave it on her desk overnight, not with the audit team arriving at 8 a.m. In her panic, Amanda remembered a conversation from the previous week's staff meeting. The audit supervisor had mentioned that obsolete duplicate documents could be disposed of if the information was already digitized in the system. The phrase echoed in her mind as she stared at the Purple Heart certificate. The computer showed William's service record. Didn't that make the paper certificate technically redundant? "Mr. Martinez," she called out, her voice higher than usual, "I need to resolve this filing issue before we close. The audit protocols are very specific about overnight document storage." Gary, deep in conversation with Robert about William's intelligence service, waved dismissively. "Just handle it according to standard procedure, Amanda. We'll be done here in a few minutes." But Amanda was beyond rational thinking. The combination of weeks of pressure, fear of losing her job, and genuine confusion about the new policies had pushed her past her breaking point. She picked up the Purple Heart certificate, looking at it not as a family treasure, but as a filing problem that needed to be solved immediately. This was the moment when Amanda Phillips made a decision that would haunt her forever. Standing at her desk with the certificate in her hand, she convinced herself that disposing of duplicate paperwork was not only acceptable, but required under the new audit guidelines. The digital record was complete, the family had copies at home, and keeping the original would violate federal protocol. Without announcing her intention, without seeking additional guidance, Amanda walked to the industrial paper shredder behind her workstation. The machine's red power light glowed steadily, waiting. In her panicked state, she saw only a solution to her immediate compliance problem, not the destruction of an irreplaceable piece of history. "Wait!" Robert called out, suddenly realizing what was happening. But Amanda had already fed the certificate into the shredder. The sound of tearing paper filled the office as 78 years of family history disappeared into metal teeth. The Purple Heart certificate that had survived World War II, the Pacific Theater, decades of careful preservation, and the discrimination faced by Chinese American soldiers was gone in seconds. The waiting room fell completely silent. Gary Martinez stared in horror at what his clerk had just done. The veterans who had been sharing stories about William's service stood frozen, unable to process what they had witnessed. Amanda, suddenly realizing the magnitude of her mistake from the shocked faces around her, tried desperately to explain. "The computer has all the information. We're not supposed to keep original documents overnight. I was following the audit protocols." Robert stood motionless, staring at the shredder that had just consumed the most precious thing his family owned. The words he'd practiced for months, explanations about his grandfather's service, stories about family history, careful descriptions of William's sacrifice, all seemed meaningless now. The physical connection to his grandfather, the tangible proof of belonging that had anchored 3 generations of his family, was gone. But as the initial shock faded, something else emerged in Robert's chest, an anger so pure and righteous that it surprised him. This wasn't just bureaucratic incompetence. This was a desecration of everything his grandfather had fought for. The discrimination William had faced in the military, the struggles of Chinese American families to prove their loyalty, the decades of quiet dignity in the face of prejudice, all of it had led to this moment where a government employee casually destroyed the proof of his sacrifice. "You just destroyed a Purple Heart certificate," Robert said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of 3 generations of suppressed outrage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the office understood that what happened next would determine whether William Chen's sacrifice meant anything at all. Gary Martinez was already reaching for his phone, but Robert stopped him with a gesture. "No," he said firmly. "This time, I'm making the call myself." He pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number he'd obtained years earlier, but never expected to use, the direct line to Congressman Rodriguez's office, gotten during a community meeting about Veterans Affairs. The response to Robert's phone call was immediate and overwhelming. Congressman Rodriguez, a Marine veteran who had served in Iraq, took the call personally within minutes. After hearing Robert's account of what had happened, the congressman's reaction was swift and decisive. "Mr. Chen, this is absolutely unacceptable. A Purple Heart certificate isn't just paperwork, it's sacred. I'm calling the Secretary of Veterans Affairs right now." But the congressman's outrage set off a chain reaction that surprised everyone. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs, already under scrutiny for the ongoing records audit, immediately contacted the Secretary of Defense to report that a World War II Purple Heart certificate had been destroyed through government negligence. Secretary Lloyd Austin, himself a veteran, viewed this as a direct attack on military honor and the sacrifice of all service members. At exactly 5:04 p.m., 4 minutes after the Phoenix VA office had officially closed, Amanda Phillips's desk phone rang with an urgency that made everyone in the building freeze. Gary Martinez answered, expecting perhaps a routine administrative call. Instead, he found himself speaking directly to a Pentagon liaison officer. "This is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, calling on behalf of Secretary Austin," the voice said with unmistakable military authority. "I need to speak with whoever destroyed Master Sergeant William Chen's Purple Heart certificate immediately." The formal tone, the mention of the Secretary of Defense, and the speed of the response made it clear that this was no ordinary bureaucratic inquiry. Amanda, now fully understanding the catastrophic nature of her decision, tried desperately to explain the circumstances. "Ma'am, I was following audit protocols about overnight document storage. The information was already in our computer system, and we were specifically told to dispose of duplicate paperwork." Her voice shook as she spoke, the reality of her situation becoming clearer with each word. Colonel Mitchell's response was immediate and unforgiving. "Ms. Phillips, there is no protocol in existence that authorizes the destruction of military decorations. A Purple Heart certificate is not duplicate paperwork. It is a sacred document honoring American sacrifice. You have committed an act that dishonors every veteran who has ever served." The breakthrough came when Secretary Austin himself decided to personally intervene. Within 2 hours of the incident, his office had mobilized military historians, Pentagon archivists, and Veterans Affairs specialists to begin the unprecedented process of recreating not just William Chen's Purple Heart certificate, but conducting a complete review of his previously classified service record. Master Sergeant Chen represents the thousands of Asian American service members who fought for a country that didn't always recognize their contributions, Secretary Austin said in an emergency press conference. "The destruction of his Purple Heart certificate is an insult to every American who has served, and we will ensure that this family receives the honor and recognition they deserve." The investigation into William's service revealed something extraordinary that had been buried in classified files for decades. He had not only earned his Purple Heart through combat wounds, but had been part of a Chinese-American intelligence unit that provided crucial translation services during some of the Pacific Theater's most dangerous operations. His unit's work had saved countless American lives, but the classified nature of their missions had prevented proper recognition. 2 weeks after the original certificate was destroyed, Robert Chen found himself standing in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by his children and grandchildren who had flown in from across the country. Secretary Austin personally presented him with not only a recreated Purple Heart certificate, but also a Distinguished Service Cross that his grandfather had earned but never received, and a Presidential Unit citation for his intelligence work. Master Sergeant William Chen embodied the courage and sacrifice that defines American military service, Secretary Austin said during the ceremony. His family's dedication to preserving his memory honors us all, and we are honored to finally give him the recognition he earned. Emma, Robert's granddaughter, whose school project had started this journey, stood beside him as he accepted the honors, finally understanding the full story of her great-great-grandfather's sacrifice. Amanda Phillips was terminated from federal service and banned from handling military records. The incident triggered a complete overhaul of VA document handling procedures with mandatory training on the significance of military decorations. Gary Martinez, whose professionalism throughout the crisis had been exemplary, was promoted to Regional Director of Veteran Services with a mandate to prevent similar incidents. The Chen Protocol now requires supervisor approval before any military decoration or certificate can be disposed of, and establishes clear procedures for handling irreplaceable military documents. More importantly, Robert's fight sparked a national conversation about the treatment of veterans' families and the sacred nature of military recognition. William's story, once nearly lost to a paper shredder, became a symbol of the hidden contributions of Asian American service members throughout U.S. military history. The Pentagon established a new archive dedicated to recovering and preserving the records of minority service members whose contributions had been overlooked or classified. Sometimes it takes the destruction of something precious to remind us that honor once earned can never truly be destroyed, only forgotten by those who fail to understand its value.